Hi there. I am trying to create a sigil or sign or hieroglyph, I suppose you might call it, of my particular Gnostic beliefs or my take on Gnosticism, as it were, based on all the contemplation and research that I've done to date. Of course, Gnosticism, as someone reminded me, is a portable device and adaptable as well. And as new data comes in, so your Gnosticism changes, irrespective of what gnosis you actually receive, and because you never really stop studying Gnosticism, as it were, in all its many guises as well. So this video is a presentation which is sort of preliminary to the creation of my final hieroglyph or final thoughts on what I understand to be Gnosticism and spirituality, for that matter. And I was considering or contemplating who or what God is, and all the different theories that people have come up with and different paradigms. I suppose this is only a basic schema because there's probably a lot more complexity attached to who people think God is or what people think God is. I mean, starting from here, and this is kind of like the sort of there's two ends here. There's the least metaphysical, this end, and there's the least metaphysical, this end as well. So starting off here with the idea that God is a principle. Really, God doesn't exist, has no metaphysical reality or existence. And this is sort of like the kind of liberal Christianity where God is literally a symbol or a principle of the greatest good, or even the highest potential that an individual can reach, sort of the best that you can be. And so God represents this as a principle, as a symbol. So, the best that you can be is of supreme value, and this is called God. But it's not. It's not. There's no real God attached to this principle or idea or ideal. And then I might also add here that God can sometimes be idealized nature as well, which is another subcategory of principle, because I think in the 1980s, with deep environmentalism sort of coming to fruition, the idea of the gods or God or goddess, really, as it was then, represented the principle of idealized nature and sort of composited with the idea of feminism as well, and sexual liberation and identity politics of the 1980s, very far removed from any kind of metaphysical consideration. However, there's some people who think of the Gaia concept. So we have this idea that God or goddess or Gaia is a universal algorithm or set of algorithms, basically a dynamic equilibrium between all the parts of the universe and all the ecosystems and all the individual beings that create an ecosystem. So you've got, everything. It's like a sort of green brain. Frank Herbert's little short story called The Green Brain, which is basically where nature has a sort of intelligence, a sort of super algorithmic intelligence attached to it, and in the way it functions. And my cursor's going a bit weird here. And also, so that's kind of not very existential. That's kind of metaphysical in the sense of looking at nature in a certain way. And then we come to the very famous Buddhist idea that you can have any god or goddess that you like, and each one of the gods and goddesses is merely a form that is empty, and that emptiness is filled with the Buddha consciousness or the Buddha nature. So you look at something and it's it's like the goddess or the god is like a sort of chalice, and you pour the liquid into the chalice, and the liquid is the Buddha nature. So it's merely a god or a goddess, according to Mahayana Buddhism or the Great Wheel Buddhism, is simply a way of looking at your Buddha nature. And I suppose really also that you're projecting your own culture, your own personality onto something which has no personality, which is just a sort of emptiness, as it were. Buddha nature, emptiness are the things that fill the form, but the form literally can be anything. And so you can take gods and goddesses and myths from any part of the world and from animism, etc., and you empty them out of their literal sense, and you replace the literal sense of the god or goddess with the Buddha nature instead. So that, I guess that's not very metaphysical either, because Theravada Buddhism, which is the source of Buddhism, is again very, very far removed. It doesn't have any metaphysics attached to it. Even the stories of the Buddha and the miracles of the Buddha, again, they are empty. And the Buddha nature, the understanding of Buddhism, flows into those various miracle stories, which are each of which are a vessel by which you can make the Buddha nature intelligible to yourself and to others. You see. So that's kind of the Buddhist way of looking at gods and goddesses, or God. And then there's the impersonal transcendence, and this is very much the Western magical tradition, really. There is a sort of transcendence. You can't even call it a being or a personality. It's simply it's probably the transhuman. It's probably the human transcending itself and projected out. Let us say that we have yet to fulfill our potential as human beings, and so our future state basically is God. So God is our future state projected out into some further into a time that has not yet happened, and that's kind of an impersonal transcendence. So it's impersonal at the moment, but it will be filled with our transcendent personality when we reach our true potential, our true magical potential. So that's very. So God is basically our future selves, to put it in a nutshell. And then you have. This is very interesting. We come to sort of what the Hindus call impersonal Brahmin, and I've got here the current bun mix. The idea basically is impersonal Brahmin is the cake mixture or the current bun mixture, and the gods and goddesses are the currents that are in the mixture. So the spiritual stuff is the impersonal Brahmin, but there are various sort of personalities that you can see, that you can consume, the currants or the chocolate chips, and these really make the cake mixture more palatable, I suppose. Really, so that makes again you're making the inexpressible expressible through form. So the current bun mixture analogy, for understanding impersonal Brahmin is pretty similar to the Buddhist idea of form and emptiness, I think, anyway. But and that some people might say, what on earth are you talking about there? And so we go on to the transcendental. Yes, the personal transcendental God. And it's obviously this is the God, the transcendental God, which exists in the transcendental realm, the Gnostic God, I suppose, as you might call it. Now it's a God among gods because even though it might be one God within its own realm, transcendental realm, there are other gods which exist in the lower worlds or in the worlds of the demiurge. So that's why I call it personal transcendent God among other gods. But also here we come to another category, a subcategory, which is called the avatars. And there could be that there are gods and goddesses who are actually avatars of the transcendental God, that are sort of like aspects of the Holy Spirit. They kind of project out from the transcendental realms and sort of come down into the realms of the demiurge where the soul is imprisoned in order to help us. And in Mahayana Buddhism, actually, a lot of the Buddhas to be and Theravadas, they are bodhisattvas rather. Bodhisattvas are sort of avatars of the Buddha nature that come down to the lower realms in order to help us. For example, Tara or Amitabha, for example, is another god that's a wish-fulfilling god. And so there are gods that come back from the Buddha realm full of compassion to help souls that are trapped here, trapped in karma in the Buddhist sense, or in the Gnostic sense, trapped in evil matter. So this is very important, the subcategory, the avatar category of the transcendental God among gods. Or one god could be one demiurge and his agents, which could be demigods of the god, demiurge god, if you see what I mean. And then quickly going on to the kind of personal, indefinable deity or divinitas. Again, this is going away perhaps from a metaphysical understanding of God, and going back to a sort of, I suppose this God is almost a reflection of a higher self, or the true will, or the magical self of the person. But obviously it's personal because it's part of you. It's your transcendent part, which is yet indefinable, and yet which is divine, of supreme value. So that category probably goes with the former category that I described about principle. And then there's the personal historical deity. This very much links to the idea of avatars. For example, I used to be obviously very interested in Hinduism, and I would account myself a Shivite, and also worshipper of Kali as well. So they be historic actually, historic figures or historic deities, deities that we worshipped in the Middle Ages, particularly in India. It's a bit complicated now because, of course, Shiva and Kali are all aspects of Vishnu and all aspects of Krishna now. So they've all been subsumed or absorbed into Vishnavite thinking, really. But the idea is that you could look at a historic god such as Odin, and you could make Odin your personal deity, sort of thing, which is getting much more sort of polytheistic as well. But the reason why I include this is because it could be that Lord Shiva, for example, is an avatar of the transcendental God. So not all the gods and goddesses are demiurgical in that sense. They're not all lower gods and goddesses. Some of them are avatars of the Most High God. And it could be that Shiva, in Hindu terms, is an avatar of the impersonal Brahmin, for example. And that's certainly a possibility as well. But then again, we'll get on to the sort of God is the tribal totemic God. I sometimes think that people descend. This is a very sort of low concept of God, although obviously historical in the sense that there definitely used to be totemic and tribal gods, and in fact there still are, of course, even extending to Protestant and Catholic. So I think sometimes in Northern Ireland it certainly used to be that there were two gods, a Protestant god and a Catholic god, and they represented the sort of the tribe of Protestant and the tribe of Catholic within Ulster itself, you see. And of course, that leads to partisan thinking. It leads to tribal violence and war. In the Middle Ages in India, of course, the Vaishnavites actually had religious war with the Shivites, and India was very divided between Vishnu worship and Shiva worship. And of course, then there was a tendency to say that Vishnu and Shiva are actually all aspects of the one, which meant you didn't have to go to war over them, which is kind of nice. And then finally, sometimes I think people, there's God is a kind of identifier with a group. I suppose it's a bit like a tribal God, but literally, there's no literal God. It's just that there is sort of this higher power that identifies a group of people. For example, Alcoholics Anonymous, I was thinking, or Gamblers Anonymous, where the individual recognizes a higher power, which is an identifier with the group of recovered alcoholics or gamblers, you see. But I mean, that's a bit of a moot point, because some people may, of course, bring their own religion to the table, and they understand higher power as Jesus or Islam or Allah. So that's a kind of a bit of a dubious category. Well, my point here is to demonstrate that the transcendental God is definitely a sort of monotheistic idea. But I wanted to introduce polytheistic notions, that certain gods and goddesses are avatars of the one God, which is, as I said, not far removed from the Hindu idea that certain gods and goddesses are aspects of the one, of the impersonal Brahmin. Indeed, all 33,000 gods and goddesses of Hinduism are aspects of the one, aspects of the transcendental impersonal Brahmin. So I wanted to be able to sort of say that, you could put Kununos as an avatar of the transcendental God. And that would mean that certain gods and goddesses had a transcendental element or aspect to them. Otherwise, you might end up sort of putting Shiva in the kind of category of the demiurge, for example. And somebody also said to me they didn't really fancy the idea of even putting the Jewish God as a demiurge. They didn't like Marcion, and they weren't going to go that far as Marcion did, and they didn't like the fact that the God of the Jews was the same as a demiurge. They didn't like that idea. They wanted to have the God of the Jews as an avatar of a transcendental God, because they were Kabbalists as well. So they definitely weren't happy. I mean, the idea that Marcion's idea that the God of the Old Testament is this evil God of demiurge is like it sticks in a lot of people's gullets. Really, they really can't accept that. They hate that idea. And you do want to stay with ideas that are comfortable for you, because again, this is modernism we're talking about. I mean, we're not as literal as we used to be, pre-Enlightenment, pre-18th, 17th century, literalism was obviously the norm. But really, we have a lot of our understanding of God has become so modernist, so post-Enlightenment, that we almost tend to really discount the idea of there actually being a God out there, a personal God, or even a personal demiurge for that matter, or even some sort of a demonic figure or divine figure. We tend to kind of think now more in terms of these are aspects of the one or aspects of the higher self, or we tend to have a more as I say, a post-Enlightenment view of God now, which is pretty hard to shake off, unless you're a rabid fundamentalist, which I mean, you certainly could be. I don't think that literalism is such a bad thing. I didn't like it when I was being brought up a fundamentalist Christian, because it seemed to me that Jesus was really just being used as a tribal sort of totem, almost a group identifier, a sort of like an in-group sort of Jesus was sort of the lord of this in-group that was this particular church. And there was nothing very universal. It was very partisan that I suppose a lot of people react against that, and they want to make God as impersonal and as universal as they possibly can. And also, when you think about Krishna, the Krishna devotees talk about the supreme personality of Krishna, and everything that his personality and his deeds as a child and his various demon slaying activities, they're all completely real on one dimension, even though they're sort of philosophically real only on another dimension. So they tend to sort of go between literalism and philosophical symbology. I mean, in philosophy, you talk about ontology, which is a study of things which exist. And often you talk about the ontological argument for the existence of God, that that God is this real thing that actually exists, and does God have a real status? Is God as real as a table? But then is a table real? And all so, and we get into that discussion. I mean, it goes round and round in circles, really, which is why Gnosticism tends to want to cut through all of it and just say, well, what does your intuition tell you? Go into your Gnostic contemplation, and what does the voice of the silence tell you about reality or about illusion? And you'll find the answers. You won't find the answers by categorizing everything. You won't find the answers through English philosophy, reductionism. You won't find it through that. You won't find it through empiricism. You'll literally just find it through your intuitive grasp of reality. What does it feel like? Does it feel real? Does God feel real to you? And then you don't really mind if other people say, well, I don't think God exists, or even that God does exist, because you know it for yourself. And you don't really even want to enter into debates about God's ontology, or even if God is a principle or an aspect of one's future self or one's higher self or whatever. Go into your own gnosis and you discover that answer for yourself, and leave other people alone to find the answer for themselves. And then we all probably will get on, and we won't fight religious wars and kill each other and torture each other and persecute each other, because you can only speak for yourself. I can't make you believe in God, or I can't argue or show you evidence or whatever for the existence of God. You have to go in within your own self and find the answer within your own self. And a lot of people, fundamentalists, hate this idea, but I don't know why, because throughout the centuries, religion has become much more individualized, and privatized, as Talcott Parsons said. He talked about privatization of religion. Religion's much more a personal thing now. It's much less tribal and totemic, much less to do with groups and in-groups and out-groups. It's much more an individual, private thing, which Gnosticism always was, in fact, and mysticism always was. It's just that mysticism and Gnosticism are now becoming more popular. So everybody is now discovering that you could be left alone to discover the truth for yourself, in particular, as far as the existence of God is concerned and the status of God is concerned, and whether there's a God of matter and a God of spirit. All these things you have to determine for yourself, rather than trying to determine them for other people. I mean, obviously, I'm on YouTube, and I'm spouting away here, and you're doing me the great favour of listening to my ramblings, and you might say, "Oh, that sounds interesting," or you might say, "That sounds rubbish," or you might say, "Wow, that's the best thing since sliced bread." I don't know. I'm not you. I can't say, and it doesn't matter to me. Whether you reject what I'm teaching or whether you accept it. And that's the big difference nowadays. And maybe people say, oh, well, this is why discipline is breaking down in society, because it's all about the individual, and none of us are working together, and we need a coronavirus to bring us all working together, and where the community spirit, and this is a problem. And I think that's all kind of like rhetoric, really. There is the self, and there is a higher self, and there is aspects of the one, and there is a transcendent God, and all these concepts. You can sort of whirl them around in your mind. Your mind's a sort of cauldron, and you can just go with the various ingredients that make up your own understanding of God, and that's what really, really counts at the end of the day.